This video is going up several days before Netflix drops the entire first season of their live-action adaptation of Avatar The Last Airbender. You know what? I am terrified they're going to ruin one of my favorite IPs of all time. Stick around and we'll go through what made the Nickelodeon cartoon an absolute masterpiece, what we have seen so far from Netflix, and worst, what we've read their intentions are for Team Avatar. See you on the other side. I know what you're thinking. Baby, you're a roguishly handsome middle-aged man. What do you know about Avatar The Last Airbender? Well, like most topics, lots. I first watched the cartoon with my two sons when they were younger in the late 2000s. I watched it again a year or so after just by myself because I found myself still thinking about the story. I was so taken by it I forced my wife to watch it right after, having to convince her that once you accepted it was a cartoon made for kids, the deeper story was well worth it. She did, and she loved it also. I've watched it since then with my sons again, and episodes out of order from time to time. And in anticipation of Netflix's adaptation, I'm midway through a full rewatch again. And you know what? It's just as beautiful and heartbreaking, alive and awe-inspiring as it was the first time I saw it. It is in every way a masterpiece that doesn't need to be updated or fixed, does it? So before we get into what Netflix is offering up, let's get this out of the way. Live-action adaptations are not the natural evolution of an animated franchise. People need to stop thinking that in order to give legitimacy to an IP, it needs to have live people in it. That's horseshit. This is beyond insulting. It automatically assumes the works done by the creators of the original were lesser than the works that would be done by creators of the live-action adaptation. It also insults the fans of the original source material, as it assumes that they'll like it better if real people are in it. But it also assumes that the best way to draw an even larger audience is to adapt it to live action. This is basically what Hollywood studios do when they buy an IP from some foreign market and slap some American actors in it and then market it to American audiences, since we're obviously too stupid or unwilling to read some subtitles, right? It also misses what makes the animation potentially superior. It can never look the same, and that's regardless of how much CGI you slap into it. What looks real and believable for characters to do in a cartoon can't always translate to live action. That's how we end up with talk about how the live action needed to be more grounded and appeal to a more adult audience. It also ignores the huge roles voice actors have in bringing a character to life. I mean, I love FX's Archer, and it would be easy to imagine a younger John Hamm playing him in live action, right? But would it ever work without H. John Benjamin providing the voice that made the whole thing go?
Lana!
What? Danger zone.
Best example is Batman. It doesn't matter how many decent Batman movies we ever get, will anyone ever really sound like Batman more than Kevin Conroy in your head?
You're not safe here. No one is. Don't worry about me. You're needed out there.
So keep this in mind as we take a look at what Netflix is dropping here. Because I'm not open to hearing arguments like, well, it was live action. How could they have made that work? Because my answer is going to remain by not doing it live action and turning this all-time classic into just a money grab. That's how. Netflix acquired the distribution rights and the rights to create a live-action adaptation after seeing how Avatar performed as a streaming show. Quickly, original creators Michael Dante DiMartino and Brian Konietzko were brought on as executive producers and showrunners, so that was a positive sign. Unlike the horrible movie by M. Night Shyamalan, this would be a series which would have the time to actually let the full story play out. I was pretty stoked. And then the creators walked in the summer of 2020 with this letter from Michael. Quote, "I can finally tell you that I am no longer involved with the project. In June of this year, after 2 years of development work, Brian Konietzko and I made the difficult decision to leave the production. When Brian and I signed on to the project in 2018, we were hired as executive producers and showrunners. In a joint announcement for the series, Netflix said that it was committed to honoring our vision for this retelling and to supporting us on creating the series. And we expressed how excited we were for the opportunity to be at the helm. Unfortunately, things did not go as we had hoped. But even an air nomad knows when it's time to cut their losses and move on. I realized I couldn't control the creative direction of the series, but I could control how I responded. So I chose to leave the project. It was the hardest professional decision I've ever had to make, and certainly not one that I took lightly, but it was necessary for my happiness and creative integrity. And who knows, Netflix's live-action adaptation of Avatar has the potential to be good. It might turn out to be a show many of you end up enjoying. But what I can be certain about is that whatever version ends up on screen, it will not be what Brian and I had envisioned or intended to make.
Fuck.
Now, who knows exactly what that means? It's pretty cryptic, but the takeaway is that Netflix wanted to do things the original creators didn't, and this resulted in whatever is coming isn't what they wanted, and there's no way that can be a good thing. But when I read that letter, I said, "Fuck it," and forgot about the production. It was dead to me. Then sometime later, we got news about casting, and it looked pretty great. A little later, we got some photos of the cast suited up, and it was obvious who was who, so that was kind of great as well. And when I finally saw the full-length trailer, I allowed the member berries to wash all over me, and I forgot all about Michael and Brian having walked away from the show.
Idiot!
I admit, the trailer looked pretty awesome, and for once, it actually seemed like a nice change of pace to see a studio create a thing that actually looked like the thing they were adapting, without making glaring changes to appeal to a modern audience. Then, people around the show started doing interviews, and I remembered Michael and Brian. Despite all of them clearly knowing and loving the show based on the interviews, they still managed to not quite grasp what makes it so perfect. We'll start with new showrunner Albert Kim. When asked about taking over for Michael and Brian, he said, quote, "You'd have to be an idiot not to be intimidated a little bit. My first reaction after hell yeah was, holy shit, do I really want to do this? Is there a way to improve upon the original?" Whenever you tackle something that's already beloved by millions of fans, you have to ask yourself those questions. All of our writers are also fans of the original, so they drew upon their own personal experiences and the things that they love the best. We don't start the show the way the animated series starts. That was a conscious decision to show people this is not the animated series. We had to sometimes unravel storylines and remix them in a new way to make sense for a serialized drama, so I'm very curious to see what'll happen in terms of reaction to that. Well, first, at least this doesn't look like what's been common recently in having studios purposefully hire people with no knowledge of the source materials to helm projects. That said, I'm on record on many occasions saying I hate the idea of most adaptations specifically because there's this desire that it has to be different, that fans of the original don't want a shot-for-shot remake into live action. Well, I do, actually. I'd prefer fewer adaptations, but if you're gonna do one, do it like the original. You know, the one everyone already loves. But what's the fun in having control over an IP if you can't alter it in the way you'd like, right? So you get lines like, quote, "Is there a way to improve on the original?" unquote. A question that only has one answer in their minds. Fuck yeah. Quote, "There are certain scenes that you never saw in the original, whether it's the attack at the Southern Air Temple or the Agni Kai between Ozai and Zuko. And those are things that I knew we needed to see in order to make it feel much more grounded as a live-action show."
No, God!
Again, there's a reason countless people fell in love with this show. We knew what happened to the air temples. Not seeing us put us in the perspective of Aang. And when we do see glimpses of what happened when the gang shows up to the Southern Temple, there's an emotional impact that actually hits because we're seeing it through Aang's eyes. We're seeing the complete annihilation of his people through the eyes of this 12-year-old. It's why when he loses control and enters the Avatar state, it has so much impact. Likewise, episode 12, titled The Storm, already shows the audience the Agni Kai, and for the first time we actually understand what's driving Zuko, and we get an understanding of why his uncle Iroh, who seems like a pretty decent guy, loves him so much. Showing this in its entirety and showing so much of the Fire Lord early ruins this reveal. The Storm is such an important episode. It juxtaposes Zuko and Aang's backstories. Not only do we learn why Zuko feels the shame he does and that everyone around him that questions his loyalty are wrong about him, we see that Aang is carrying that same kind of guilt, but instead of everyone hating him, they love him, without knowing that he was missing for 100 years in part because he ran away when faced with leaving his home to train to become the Avatar. Will these themes come through with these changes? I'm worried they won't. Which brings up other changes the creators have said were made. Gawendeo Tarbell, who plays Katara, said in a recent interview, "I feel like we also took out the element of how sexist Sokka was. I feel like there were a lot of moments in the original show that were iffy." Ian Owsley, who plays Sokka, then responded, "Yeah, totally. There are things that were redirected just because it might play a little differently in live action." This just reeks of modern day filmmaking and typical current thing bullshit. Reading this makes me actually wonder if they watched the show. Yeah, Sokka is a sexist prick. At first. He comes from a culture that is clearly male-centric, and we see this further when the gang gets to the North Pole and Master Pakku refuses to teach Katara at first. The thing is, Sokka is constantly being put in his place real time every time he does this in the show. If it's not Katara doing it, it's Suki from the Kyoshi Warriors. And each time Sokka learns, going so far as to apologize to Suki where he has to humble himself and he asks her to teach him. So why not allow the show to do with Sokka as the original did, and give him an arc where he learns from his mistakes and becomes a better person? Instead, it appears Sokka's character will be deprived of that journey so as not to slightly offend someone for a minute or two until he learns his lesson. It's absurd. Quote, "The cartoon, for as great as it was 15 years ago. And so things have changed. There are certain roles I think that Katara did in the cartoon that we didn't necessarily also do here. I mean, I don't want to really get into a lot of that, but some gender issues that didn't quite translate. So we had to guard against that kind of stuff. And so those are things that aren't really changing a character as so much as updating them a little bit." What the hell is he even saying here? This sounds like Rachel Zegler turning her nose up at the original Snow White because it had been made back in 1937 and obviously were so much better than those rubes from way back in the olden days. Except in this case, Kim is talking about way back in 2008. The only thing that's changed that drastically in that small time frame is the desire to placate noisy activists with entertainment. Avatar was very progressive at the time, but it did it right. I've already addressed Sokka being given an arc that was basically one to show boys that girls can do many of the same things boys can do. Every female character has some form of agency. Katara proves she's worthy of being trained by the master in the north. We see how valuable the Kyoshi warriors are despite Sokka at first being skeptical. Princess Yue selflessly gives up her life to save the world. When we finally meet Toph, not only is she a young blind girl, but she's arguably the world's greatest earthbender. Even the female villains are total badasses. From June riding around on the Shirsu Nyla to Princess Azula's friends Mei and Ty Lee. And when Princess Azula finally shows up in Book 2, we realize she's every bit as tenacious as Zuko was, but is actually evil and more powerful and damn scary. But Michael and Brian created these compelling female characters without making them perfect. None are Mary Sue's. They all have things they need to overcome. They fail often and are forced to get back up. They need help, and that's okay. And none of them rely on the male characters around them being written to look weak and stupid in order to elevate them. They are simply interesting and capable in their own right. So to see Kim suggest that they remove certain gender roles from Katara, since that harkened back to the old values of 15 years ago, this can only mean they won't allow her to be the motherly figure for both Sokka and the gang. Again, much like removing Sokka's sexism, this lessens Katara, and it weakens the bond they all share. But this is typical for modern filmmakers who see traditional femininity or anything maternal as weakness. You saw it in Disney's ludicrous live-action remake of Peter Pan, where they ruined the Wendy character, turning her into some kind of swashbuckling boy rather than the calming, motherly influence that was the real hero of the 1953 animated classic. Think of this scene from later in the series when Team Avatar is in the Fire Nation. Toph and Sokka are talking about how annoying Katara can be, and Sokka turns to Toph and says, "I never told anyone this before, but honestly, I'm not sure I can remember what my mother looked like. It really seems like my whole life Katara's been the one looking out for me. She's always been the one that's there. And now when I try to remember my mom, Katara's is the only face I can picture." Toph responds with, "The truth is, sometimes Katara does act motherly, but that's not always a bad thing. She's compassionate and kind, and she actually cares about me. You know, the real me. That's more than my own mom.
Are you crying? What's that? Are you crying? Am I crying? No, I'm not crying. You're crying.
Oh, and keep this in mind, while Sokka's sexism and Katara being motherly are clearly seen as too problematic by today's creators to include it, seeing the genocide of the Airbenders is totally cool.
Wait a minute.
Kim has mentioned other changes as well. In addition to these two potentially huge alterations to both Katara and Sokka, Aang is going to be more focused and less apt to want to make detours, or basically a huge portion of his personality in the natural way we were shown the world of Avatar in the original. Part of what made him so endearing was him knowing he had this huge burden, but that he was also just this 12-year-old kid that had a hard time staying focused and wanted to have fun and play. It's what makes his fear so real and his journey so worth it. As mentioned earlier, we're going to get Azula and Fire Lord Ozai in the first season, which I hate. Again, we didn't need a ton of backstory for them. What we got was not only sufficient, but it added to their mystery. It also gives us time to get to know Zuko as the main antagonist. When Azula shows up with her friends, we've had time to see Zuko begin his turn. And by book 3, when Ozai becomes the focus, he's been built up perfectly. They're also not going to mention Zosin's Comet in Season 1 here, which is also a huge mistake pacing-wise, I think, because it becomes this ticking clock in the background that gives urgency to the journey. And finally, because they're using live actors and they cast them as kids, though I think Sokka and Katara seem too old already, they are all going to age out so badly by the time they ever get to Book 3 of this show. So unlike the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which shot all 3 movies essentially at the same time with adults, Netflix hasn't even announced a Season 2 here, and the main kid characters are too old already. This will end up like the Harry Potter movies where they cast age-appropriate actors to start, but due to the way movies are made, we'll all be way too old when it wraps up. That's especially bad here because a huge part of what makes this entire story compelling is these 4 kids out on their own taking on the most terrifying force on the planet to save the world. If Gordon Cormier, who plays Aang, is nearly 20 years old by the time they shoot Book 3, is it really remotely the same story then? So yeah, I hate that this looks to be a train wreck coming down the tracks. I really wish it wasn't, because I would love that if they were going to do this to have done it exceptionally well. That said, my plan is this. Netflix is dropping all 8 episodes of the show at once on Friday, February 23rd, 2024. I'm going to do an in-depth review of each one individually, comparing it to the original and letting you know what I think about it. The first one will go up on Monday the 26th, and there will be 2 reviews each week until we get through the season. I really hope you stick around for the entire run. I never really thought of it this way, but the truth is that there are few franchises I really love more than this one. So while I hate what I've heard about what's coming for us all here, I'm pretty excited to share my takes with you. So if you haven't yet, please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss them. Until next time, thanks for watching.